Okay, let's get straight to it. Why are people?
Hmm,
It's a question that's probably crossed your mind, right?
definitely. But think about this. Life's been thriving on Earth for billions of years.
Yeah, billions.
And for almost all that time, no creature had any clue why it was even here.
It's wild. And for most of human history, our answers, well, they came from myths, stories.
Exactly. It shows we're naturally curious, but, the zoologist G.G. Simpson, he put it pretty
Oh,
bluntly.
yeah? What did he say?
He basically said any attempt to figure out what is man before Darwin came along in 1859 is, and this is a direct quote, worthless.
Wow, worthless. That's
It
strong.
is strong, but it really highlights the impact of Darwin.
And that leads us right into our topic for today. Richard Dawkins' huge book, The Selfish Gene.
Seminal work, first published back in 76.
Right. And for anyone who might not know, Dawkins is, well, a giant in evolutionary biology.
Absolutely. Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature.
Wrote other major books too, like
Yeah.
The Extended Phenotype, The Blind Watchmaker.
And he's won loads of awards for his work in science and, literature as well. He's a big deal.
Definitely. So, connecting back to Simpson's point, the selfish gene offered this, well, truly revolutionary way of thinking about why we exist, didn't it?
It really did. It kind of shifted the whole focus. Instead of looking at the individual animal or even the species.
That's the main thing in evolution.
Right. Dawkins put the spotlight squarely on the gene itself.
Exactly. And that's our mission for this deep dive, really. We want to unpack the core arguments of the book.
Explore this central idea, the gene, as the fundamental unit of natural selection.
Yeah, and see how that perspective gives us this, well, sometimes surprising new way to understand behaviors, things that look selfless.
Or, obviously selfish.
Right. And importantly, Dawkins really tried to make these complex ideas accessible. He wasn't just writing for specialists.
He aimed it at the layman, as he put it, the generally curious reader.
So what are we actually looking at from the book today? What's the source material?
Good question. We're focusing on excerpts from the 40th anniversary edition.
Okay.
So we'll hit the core ideas, the
It's
foundations,
gene as a replicator.
how these genes build what he calls survival machines. That's us, basically.
Right, us and other animals.
And then we'll get into things like aggression, kin selection, that's altruism towards relatives.
Fascinating stuff. What else?
The conflict between parents and offspring, which is always interesting. Sexual selection, mate choice.
Okay.
And then the concept of memes, cultural replicators, and finally how cooperation evolves.
So yeah, a lot of the really big fundamental concepts from the book.
Definitely covers the key ground.
Okay, let's dive into that central question then. Why are people and Darwin's impact?
Yeah, Simpson's quote really nails how big a deal Darwin was. Before him, explanations were, well, not really scientific.
Mostly philosophical or theological, right?
Yeah.
No real solid basis.
Exactly. Darwin gave us that scientific foundation, evolution by natural selection.
A mechanism, a process you could actually study.
Right. It moved the question from just pure speculation into something testable, scientific.
And this is where Dawkins really runs with Darwin's ideas, especially when you look at behaviors like altruism and selfishness.
He gets really specific about defining those terms in an evolutionary context.
Okay, let's dig into that. So evolutionarily speaking, an animal's altruistic if its behavior helps another animal's welfare.
And welfare here just means its chances of surviving and reproducing.
Right. Even if it costs the first animal something in terms of its own survival and reproduction.
And selfish behavior is just the opposite, helps itself at another's expense.
And the key thing here, which is kind of mind-bending, is that even tiny, tiny effects on survival
Things that might seem totally negligible day to day.
can have massive consequences over evolutionary time,
Yeah.
millions of years.
Absolutely. That focus on tiny differences over huge timescales is crucial, and it directly challenges that common idea.
Oh yeah, the good of the species idea.
Yeah, exactly. That intuitive feeling that evolution must be working for the benefit of the whole group or species.
It seems logical, right? Reproduction continues the species, so animals should help each other out for the species' sake.
Looks like it fits. Altruism seems like it would be good for the group.
But Dawkins argues that's a false step, a mistake in reasoning.
Yeah. His point is that evolution favors the gene's survival, even if that means the group isn't perfectly harmonious.
So apparent benefits to the group are often just side effects.
Side effects of genes maximizing their own way of getting copied.
Okay, so this brings us to the debate between group selection and, Well, gene selection.
Right. The group selection idea, pushed by people like Wynne Edwards, was that groups with self-sacrificing individuals would do better.
Then groups full of selfish individuals. So the whole group survives better.
Makes intuitive sense. It kind of aligns with our own morals, doesn't it? We value self-sacrifice.
We do. We admire cooperation within teams, within communities.
But the counter-argument from the gene selection perspective is really strong.
Okay, what is it?
Well, imagine a group of mostly altruists. If a single selfish individual pops up or wanders in, they get all the benefits of the group's kindness without paying any of the costs of being altruistic themselves.
So they have an advantage. More likely to survive, have kids.
Exactly, and pass on those selfish tendencies. Over generations, selfishness spreads, and the altruistic group disappears.
Plus, what about migration? Even if you had a purely altruistic group, couldn't selfish types just move in?
That's a major problem for group selection theory. Selfish individuals could infiltrate and exploit the system.
So while group selection feels nice,
Yeah.
and we see cooperation within groups,
That cooperation often stops dead at the group boundary. Think trade unions, nations, cooperation inside, competition outside.
right, it doesn't seem to be the main engine of evolution.
The evidence points much more strongly towards the gene level.
Okay, so if it's not the species, not the group,
Yeah.
what IS driving things, Dawkins takes us way, way back.
Right back to the beginning, the primeval soup.
The primordial ooze.
Yeah. Imagine early Earth, just simple molecules floating around, and somehow the first replicators emerged.
Molecules that could make copies of themselves.
Exactly. But the raw materials, the building blocks for those copies, wouldn't have been infinite.
So scarcity kicks in. Competition.
Right. Different versions of these replicators start competing for those limited resources.
And any slight difference, like maybe one version is just a bit more stable, lasts longer,
Or maybe one version gets better at breaking down its rivals.
that version would automatically be favored. It survives, it makes more copies.
That's natural selection in its most basic form. And it's cumulative.
So over time, you get better and better replicators. Maybe some learn to break down rivals chemically.
The first protocarnivores, perhaps? And others, in response, develop defenses.
Chemical shields, physical barriers.
And maybe those barriers were the start of the first cells, replicators building protective walls around themselves.
Survival machines. Little fortresses for the genes.
Exactly. Tiny, simple ones at first, just basic protection.
But the competition keeps heating up. New, better machines arise.
Creating pressure for even more complexity. Bigger, better survival machines.
Which eventually leads to, well, us and everything else.
All driven by this relentless competition between the underlying replicators.
So these survival machines, our bodies, are essentially vehicles built by genes, which brings us to the gene as the unit of selection.
Precisely. Think about our cells. Trillions of them.
And inside each nucleus, the chromosomes.
Right. And the genes are strung along.
You get one version from each parent, so you have two alleles for eye color.
Right. And this competition at the gene level between alleles explains some really cool stuff.
Like mimicry in butterflies.
Yeah, that's a great example. You have harmless butterflies that evolved to look like nasty poisonous ones.
Because birds learn to avoid the poisonous kind after a bad experience.
Exactly. So any harmless butterfly that happens to look similar gets an advantage. Selection favors that resemblance.
And over time, the mimicry gets better and better.
But what's really neat is that within one mimicking species, you might find some individuals copying poisonous species A and others copying poisonous species B.
Like they commit to one disguise or the other?
Kind of. It's almost like being male or female, you're one or the other. It shows selection acting very specifically at the gene level for that particular mimicry pattern.
Wow. So it really highlights the gene itself.
And this leads to the crucial point. What is a gene in this evolutionary sense?
Okay.
Dawkins stresses its potential near immortality. That's the key.
So it's not just about the physical DNA in one body.
No, it's any chunk of chromosome that potentially lasts for enough generations to be worked on by natural selection.
It eats longevity.
Fecundity, the ability to get copied many times.
And copying fidelity, making accurate copies.
Those three things, that's what makes a successful replicator.
So individual bodies like ours are temporary. We die.
Right. But the genes we carry, or copies of them, can potentially go on almost forever, passed down generation after generation.
That's why the gene, not the individual, is the fundamental unit. It's the thing that lasts.
Genes are the replicators, bodies are the vehicles.
And this raises that fundamental question Dawkins brings up. Why do we even have things like sexual reproduction?
Yeah, why shuffle the genes? Why do chromosomes cross over? Why do bodies die?
These things make individual bodies temporary, but they help the genes persist and spread in new combinations.
It's a mind bender. Our individual existence is kind of secondary from the gene's long-term view.
And you mentioned earlier, just hinting at it, that a gene's environment includes other genes and the outside world.
Right, foreshadowing the idea of the extended phenotype, which we'll definitely come back to, how genes influence things beyond the body.
Okay, so if we're these survival machines built by genes, how do the genes actually control behavior? They're not pulling strings directly, are they?
No, not like puppets. It's much more indirect, but still incredibly powerful.
How does that work?
Genes build the machine. They lay down the fundamental wiring of the nervous system, the brain, the basic predispositions.
But the moment-to-moment decisions, eating, running, fighting,
Yeah,
that's the nervous system, the brain.
exactly. Dawkins uses that chess computer analogy. Genes are the programmers who write the initial rules and strategies.
But the brain plays the actual game, making moves based on the current situation.
Right. Genes set it up, but the brain runs the show day to day.
And as brains got more complex, they took on more control. Learning, memory, simulating outcomes.
For sure. The theoretical endpoint, maybe never fully reached, is genes just giving one instruction: survive and reproduce.
And then the brain figures out the best way to do that.
Pretty much. Use learning, experience, planning, whatever works.
And we see hints of this genetic influence even in complex behaviors like those hygienic bees.
Rothenbuehler's experiments, yeah. Uncapping diseased cells, removing the larvae.
It seemed like two separate genes were involved, both recessive.
Right. Crosses showed that classic Mendelian pattern. Some bees could uncap but not remove, some could remove but not uncap.
Suggesting specific genes underlie that whole behavioral sequence, not controlling every muscle twitch, but programming the tendency.
Exactly. Genes build the machinery and set the basic program. The machine then uses it to navigate the world, ultimately serving the gene's interests.
Okay, so how do these survival machines interact? Especially with their own kind. Aggression, competition.
Well, members of the same species are often your most direct competitors.
Makes sense. You need the same food, same territories, same mates.
You're similar machines running similar programs in the same environment. Another robin is way more competition for a robin than a squirrel is.
So why don't they just kill each other all the time?
Yeah.
We think of humans as uniquely violent, but animals often seem restrained. Ritualized fights.
That's where John Maynard Smith's game theory work is brilliant. The hawk and dove model.
Right, the simple simulation. Hawk always fights hard, dove just displays, runs if attacked.
Yeah, it's hypothetical, but it helps analyze strategies. They assign points: winning, losing, getting injured, wasting time.
Representing the impact on gene survival, basically.
Exactly. And the key idea that comes out is the ESS, evolutionarily stable strategy.
A strategy that, if most everyone adopts it, can't be beaten by a rare mutant strategy trying something different.
Right. And neither pure hawk nor pure dove is an ESS.
Why not?
A population of doves is easily invaded by a hawk. The hawk always wins, no risk.
Okay.
But a population of hawks is brutal, constant costly fights, lots of injuries. A dove could potentially do okay by just avoiding the fights.
So the stable state is usually something more mixed or conditional.
Often, yes. Constant fighting isn't necessarily the evolutionary endpoint. Restraint can pay off.
What strategies do tend to be stable then?
One famous one is retaliator, or tit for tat.
How does that work?
Basically, be nice first, just display. But if your opponent attacks, fight back. If they display, you display. Mirror their last move.
Seems reasonable.
It often does well in simulations. There are variations too, like probe or retaliator, which are also pretty stable.
What about that resident wins, intruder runs away rule?
That can also be an ESS. It seems arbitrary, but if everyone follows it, conflicts get settled quickly without fights.
And a mutant hawk trying to fight everyone might actually get injured more often fighting residents.
Could happen. These stable states aren't necessarily permanent. They can shift over evolutionary time.
And things like dominance hierarchies in chickens or monkeys, where they learn their place.
That's another way to reduce fighting. Individuals recognize each other, remember past encounters. It can lead to less overall conflict.
Which might even benefit the group indirectly, like those hens laying more eggs in a stable hierarchy.
Right. It's interesting how similar outcomes, like cooperation.
Like the rowing crew analogy he uses.
Yeah. That can happen because genes are physically linked, or just because independent genes get selected for behaviors that happen to work well together, like in an ESS.
Okay, so that covers aggression. What about the flip side? Altruism towards relatives. That seems tricky for a selfish gene.
It does seem tricky. How can a gene for self-sacrifice spread?
This is where kin selection comes in, right?
Exactly. Think about a recessive gene, like for albinism. You need 2 copies to be albino, but you can carry 1 copy without showing it.
Okay.
Now imagine a hypothetical gene that makes an albino sacrifice itself, but in doing so saves, say, 10 other albinos.
Who are also likely carrying that same altruism gene, or at least the albino gene.
Well, if they are albino, they must have 2 copies. So the gene causing the sacrifice could actually increase in frequency in the population, even though the individual carrying it died.
Because more copies of the gene survived in the relatives who were saved.
Precisely. The gene is being selfish by promoting aid to copies of itself in other bodies.
And Hamilton's work in 1964 really formalized this.
Hugely important. Kin selection. He showed mathematically that altruism can evolve if the cost to the altruist is less than the benefit to the recipient, weighted by their relatedness.
Hamilton's rule, CRB.
Yep. C is cost, B is benefit, and R is the coefficient of relatedness.
And R is the probability they share a particular gene,
Right.
but compared to the average population.
Exactly. It's about sharing rare genes, above and beyond the baseline similarity everyone has.
So siblings share roughly half their rare genes, R at 0.5.
On average, yes, because they get them from the same parents. Distant cousins share far fewer.
First cousins share grandparents. That's R at 0.125, 1/8.
Right. You calculate it based on the generation links and common ancestors.
Dawkins uses that mushroom example. An animal finds 8 mushrooms. Should it call out?
Depends who's nearby. If a brother or 0.5 is close, the benefit to the shared genes might outweigh the cost of sharing.
But maybe not if only a cousin R0.125 is around.
Exactly. And these aren't conscious calculations the animal makes?
No, it's the result of selection over eons. Genes that produce behaviors that, on average, helped copies of themselves in relatives just did better.
It's based on the gene's statistical experience over evolutionary history.
And this explains real-world stuff like herring gulls. They don't recognize their eggs.
But they guard any egg in their own nest. Since nests are far apart, it usually is their egg. A simple rule works.
Whereas guillemots nest close together on cliffs.
And they do recognize their own distinctively patterned eggs. They have to.
Because a simple care for any egg nearby rule would be totally open to cheating in a dense colony.
Right. Someone could just lay eggs and let others raise them. That system wouldn't last.
And the arms race between cuckoos and host birds. Cuckoo egg mimicry versus host discrimination.
It's all about maximizing your own gene survival, whether you're the parasite or the host.
Even in lion prides, the cooperation levels seem to track relatedness.
Yeah, Bertram estimated relatedness among coalition males around 0.22, females around 0.15. The observed altruism kind of fits those averages.
It's a powerful explanatory framework. Okay, shifting gears slightly. What about family planning? Birth control. Seems anti-selfish gene.
Well, that was the group selection argument from Wynne Edwards again. Individuals limit births for the good of the group, prevent overpopulation.
But that contradicts basic natural selection, right?
Yeah.
How does a gene for having fewer offspring spread?
It generally doesn't. A gene for having more viable offspring would usually outcompete it.
So David Lack had a different idea, a selfish gene explanation.
Yes, focusing on optimal clutch size for the individual.
Not just laying as many eggs as possible.
No, it's about maximizing the number of offspring you can successfully raise to independence. There's a trade-off.
Too many eggs means you can't feed them all properly. Maybe fewer survive in total than if you'd laid a smaller number.
Exactly. Lack argued parents evolved to lay the clutch size that, on average, yields the most surviving young for them. It's individual optimal.
And Shriver's built on this with parental investment.
Right. Any resource, time, energy, food spent on one offspring that reduces the parent's ability to invest in other offspring, now or in the future. It's a currency.
Okay, so parents are investing optimally for their genes. But what about the offspring? Do they just passively accept this?
Now we get to parent-offspring conflict.
Because their genetic interests aren't perfectly aligned.
Exactly. A mother is related by 0.5 to all her offspring, so genetically she shouldn't have favorites, maybe just favoring those most likely to survive.
But she's related 1.0 to herself.
Right, so there's a balance between investing in current offspring and saving resources for her own survival and future reproduction.
And the child, it's related 0.5 to its siblings.
But 1.0 to itself, twice as related to itself as to its siblings.
So from its genetic viewpoint, It wants more than its fair share of parental resources compared to its siblings.
Precisely. Think piglets scrambling for the best nipple, kids fighting over cake. It's genetic self-interest playing out.
And that chilling idea about the runt, if it's really weak.
The theory suggests there could be a point where the cost of keeping it alive is more than double the benefit it gets compared to what that investment could do for healthy siblings.
So genetically, it might be better for the runt's genes if it just gave up.
So resources go to siblings who are more likely to survive and pass on those shared genes. It's harsh, but follows the logic.
This leads to the battle of the generations. Offspring trying to manipulate parents.
Psychological warfare. Kids exaggerating hunger, seeming younger or more in danger than they are.
To extract more investment, and parents needing to detect this deception.
Right, like the baby cuckoo's relentless begging. Is it just hungry or is it blackmailing the foster parents?
The idea being the loud cry mimics a whole brood or maybe even attracts predators, forcing the parents to feed it to shut it up.
Genes for loud screaming spread in cuckoos. Genes for responding to loud screams spread in hosts, because that interaction, however parasitic, led to reproductive success historically.
And the even darker thought, could baby swallows actively push siblings' eggs out?
The logic fits. Eliminate the competition for resources. Maximize your own survival prospects.
It connects back to clutch size, too. The parent wants the optimal number it can raise.
But each individual baby might prefer a smaller clutch if it means it gets a bigger slice of the parental pie.
So there's this constant tension. Parent wants to distribute investment evenly, relative to need. Each baby wants more than its share.
Exactly. And who wins this conflict? Alexander argued parents should win, maybe due to genetic asymmetry.
But Dawkins disagrees.
Yeah, he points out the 50% relatedness is symmetrical, and a gene good for parents might have been bad when they were young. He leans towards a child ultimately winning in the long run because its whole reproductive future is ahead of it.
Fascinating. So conflict within families leads us to conflict between the sexes, too. Sexual selection, mate choice.
Absolutely. Sexual reproduction adds whole new layers of strategic interaction.
It starts with the difference in sex cells, right? Anisogamy.
Yeah. Probably evolved from isogamy where all gametes were the same size. But then some got slightly larger, providing more resources for the embryo.
Advantageous.
But that created an opening for smaller, more mobile gametes to evolve sperm that just seek out and fertilize the large, resource-rich eggs.
So females invest a lot in each egg. Males produce cheap sperm in vast numbers.
That fundamental asymmetry sets up different selective pressures and potential strategies.
Like the coy female wanting long courtship versus the fast female, and faithful versus philanderer males.
These aren't conscious choices, but genetically influenced tendencies. Which strategy works best depends on what others in the population are doing. It's dynamic.
And courtship rituals, elaborate dances, males feeding females.
Can be seen as females assessing male quality or males making an initial investment, sometimes dramatically, like the praying mantis.
Yeah, where the female eats the male, that's some serious investment.
Literally investing his body in the offspring.
And Darwin's idea of sexual selection traits favored just because they attract mates, like the peacock's tail.
Even if they seem bad for survival, but then Zahavi came along with the handicap principle.
Which seems counterintuitive. Why would costly handicaps be attractive?
Zahavi argued they have to be costly to be honest signals of quality. Only a genuinely fit male can afford the handicap, like a huge tail, and still survive. It proves he has good genes. Faking is too difficult.
So it's a reliable indicator because it's costly.
Exactly. Which could explain why males are often gaudy and females drab.
Males take risks to attract mates. Cheap sperm means potentially high reproductive payoff. Females are more cautious, expensive eggs need good genes.
The optimal trade-off between attracting mates and avoiding predators is different for each sex.
And humans. We have such varied cultures. Monogamy, promiscuity, harems.
Culture obviously plays a huge role, but maybe there are underlying evolutionary tendencies, perhaps for males towards more promiscuity, females towards more selectivity, shaped by that initial gamete difference. It's debated.
Okay, let's switch focus a bit.
Yeah.
What about things like alarm calls, seemingly altruistic?
Yeah, warning others about a predator seems risky for the caller, though Dawkins notes many calls are actually designed to be hard to locate.
Maybe benefiting nearby kin.
That's one possibility. But what about stotting? Those gazelles doing high jumps when a predator approaches.
That looks suicidal, drawing attention to yourself.
Totally counterintuitive. But Zahavi applied his handicap idea here, too.
How?
He suggested stotting is signal to the predator. The gazelle is saying, look how fit and agile I am. I can waste energy on these pointless jumps. Don't bother chasing me. Chase someone weaker.
Wow. So it's an honest, costly signal of fitness aimed at deterring the predator.
That's the hypothesis. A risky-looking behavior that's actually self-serving at the gene level.
Mind blown. Okay, now for the ultimate example of cooperation and apparent altruism. Social insects. Ants, bees, termites.
Huge colonies, often from one queen. And most individuals are sterile workers.
Different castes doing different jobs, foraging, defense, nursing. Only the queen and drones reproduce.
Worker sterility is the big puzzle. How does evolution favor genes for not reproducing? Seems like pure altruism on a massive scale.
How does the selfish gene explain this?
Hamilton's other brilliant insight, haplodiploidy, the weird genetic system in ants, bees, and wasps.
Females come from fertilized eggs, diploid. Males from unfertilized haploid.
Right, and because of this, female workers are actually more closely related to their full sisters, or 0.75, than they would be to their own daughters.
Wait, more related to sisters than daughters. How?
Because they share all of their father's genes, since he's haploid, and half their mother's. It averages out higher than the standard parent offspring 0.5.
So by helping their mother queen raise more sisters.
A worker is actually propagating more of her own genes than if she tried to reproduce herself. It's super nepotism driven by gene-level selfishness.
That's incredible. And Trevers and Hare tested this with sex ratios.
Yeah. The queen is equally related to sons and daughters, 0.5, so her optimum investment is 1.1.
But the workers are more related to their sisters, 0.75, than their brothers, 0.25.
So their genetic optimum is to bias investment towards reproductive sisters, a 3.1 ratio favoring females.
A conflict of interest within the colony. Queen wants 1.1, workers want 3.1.
And Trevers and Hare found that in many ant species, the actual investment ratio is closer to 3.1, suggesting the workers are winning this conflict, controlling resource allocation.
Amazing evidence for the selfish gene perspective, even in these hyper-cooperative societies. Okay, so that covers Kim. What about cooperation between non-relatives?
Much harder to explain. Simultaneous exchange is easy. I scratch your back, you scratch mine right now.
But if there's a delay, I'll scratch yours now if you scratch mine later.
Then the temptation to cheat is huge. Take the grooming, but don't return the favor.
Dawkins uses the sucker and cheat strategies.
Yeah.
Suckers always groom, cheats accept, but never reciprocate.
Cheats always do better in the short term. They get groomed for free. So cheats spread, suckers die out.
And the whole cooperative system could collapse.
Yeah.
So how does cooperation between non-relatives ever get started or maintained?
This is where we need to consider repeated interactions and strategies like tit for tat, often framed using the prisoner's dilemma.
But before we get to that game theory, Dawkins introduces a whole different kind of replicator.
Ah, yes. Memes. Units of cultural inheritance.
Ideas, tunes, catchphrases, fashions, technologies, things that spread through imitation.
He argues the same principles of replication and selection can apply here. Evolution isn't just for genes.
Humphrey's idea of memes as living structures, parasitizing brains.
Like the belief in an afterlife being physically wired into millions of brains. It's a powerful analogy.
So do memes have to have a biological advantage to spread?
Not necessarily, according to Dawkins. Once brains evolved providing the soup for memes, memes could take on a life of their own, replicating according to their own logic, sometimes even conflicting with genetic interests.
And meme success also depends on longevity, fecundity, and copying fidelity.
Analogous to genes, yes. Though copying fidelity for memes often seems lower, ideas mutate and get twisted as they spread.
Like that old Lang Syne example everyone adds, for the sake of, even though it wasn't originally there, a successful mutation.
Or scientific ideas spreading via citations, fashion trends taking off, viral videos, they're all memes replicating.
He even looks at citation patterns for Hamilton's papers as a kind of Hamilton meme spreading through science.
And notes how a common miscitation, a mutant meme, spread after appearing in Wilson's sociobiology. It shows how errors can replicate too.
Brains are the hardware for memes, and he draws that parallel to computer viruses.
Self-replicating information patterns in a digital medium. And he makes a sharp point about blind faith.
Believing without evidence. He sees it as a potent, potentially dangerous meme strategy that discourages critical thinking.
Contrasting it sharply with the evidence-based acceptance of evolution. He even coins memeoids for people whose own survival seems secondary to the memes they carry, like in ideological conflicts.
A stark warning about the power of ideas.
Yeah.
Okay, so bringing memes and cooperation together. How does the selfish gene framework explain cooperation between non-relatives dealing with that cheating problem?
Back to the prisoner's dilemma, the classic setup. Two prisoners, confess or stay silent.
Cooperate, silent, or defect, confess. If one defects and the other cooperates, the defector gets rewarded, the cooperator gets hammered.
If both defect, they both get a moderate penalty. If both cooperate, they both get a small penalty.
And the paradox is, the rational choice for each individual acting selfishly is always to defect.
But if both defect, they end up worse off than if they had both cooperated.
So in a one-off game, cooperation seems doomed.
But what if they play repeatedly? The iterated prisoner's dilemma.
Now the future matters. Strategies can evolve.
This is where Robert Axelrod's tournaments were key. He had computer programs playing strategies against each other.
And the winner was tit for tat.
Surprisingly often, yes. That simple strategy. Cooperate first, then just copy your opponent's last move.
It's nice, doesn't defect first, forgiving, returns to cooperation quickly, and not envious, just tries to do well, not beat the opponent.
Exactly. Although later analysis showed slight variations might be even more robust, the core principles hold. Reciprocity, niceness, forgiveness.
And this applies because many real-world interactions aren't zero-sum, right? Not like chess where one wins, one loses.
Right. They're non-zero sum. Mutual benefit is possible, like trade negotiations or even that football match example.
Bristol versus Coventry, where news changed it so a draw benefited both, and they cooperated.
Perfect example of a non-zero sum game where cooperation emerged.
And the key is iteration, the shadow of the future. Knowing you'll interact again encourages cooperation.
If you know it's the very last round, the incentive to defect comes back strongly.
The WWI Christmas truce is like a real-world iterated prisoner's dilemma. Spontaneous tit-for-tat cooperation.
And the anecdotes about apologies before resuming fighting show that forgiving element, until higher command enforced defection anyway.
And maybe vampire bats sharing blood. Repeated interactions among known roostmates fits the requirements for reciprocal altruism.
It's a plausible explanation based on these principles.
Okay, so let's pull this all together. Back to the big picture. Why are people? What's the core message from the gene's perspective?
It's that profound shift. We tend to think DNA serves the organism.
But the selfish gene view says the organism serves the DNA. The organism is the vehicle, the gene is the replicator.
Our bodies are survival machines built by genes for the gene's propagation.
And this leads directly into the extended phenotype concept again.
Right. The gene's influence doesn't stop at the skin of its vehicle.
Beaver dams, spider webs, bird nests. These are phenotypic effects of genes outside the body.
Even parasite manipulation. Flukes making snails behave differently to get eaten by birds. That's the fluke's genes, extending their phenotype into the snail's behavior.
Or viruses making us sneeze to spread themselves. Rabies, making animals bite.
These are all extended phenotypic effects, genes reaching out to manipulate the environment, including other organisms, to help themselves replicate.
The cuckoo manipulating foster parents is another prime example.
Absolutely. So when we talk levels of selection, organisms and groups compete as potential vehicles.
But the replicator is the gene. Individual selection is really about vehicle competition.
And this explains why parasite and host genes conflict different replicators with different exit strategies from the shared vehicle.
Whereas genes within one organism mostly cooperate because they share the same exit, sperm or eggs.
Exactly. And why groups don't merge into superorganisms, no shared unified exit strategy for all the genes involved. The stereotyped life cycle starting from a single cell helps maintain the integrity of the individual vehicle.
Okay, reflecting back from the 40th anniversary edition, Dawkins felt the core message held up well.
Largely, yes. Science advances, details change. He notes scientists often enjoy being wrong about specifics as it leads to progress.
But the basic definition of the evolutionary Gene Williams definition, essentially something that lasts long enough to be selected that remains central.
Right. His focus was always gene frequency change in populations, the core of evolution, not the mechanics of development.
And reiterating, individuals are vehicles, frequency of one, they don't replicate in the same way genes do.
He also revisits Hamilton's rule, emphasizing relatedness R is relative to the background population, not absolute similarity.
And mentions how genomics now lets us trace population history through patterns in our own DNA.
Right. And while origin of life details might change, the need for a self-replicator at the start remains constant.
He clarifies that replicator versus replica distinction again. Books are replicas, genes are replicators, only replicators evolve.
And touches on ESS again, still valuable for thinking clearly, especially without full genetic details. It doesn't require assuming asexual reproduction.
Addresses those clonal aphids, still social, because individuals have organismal properties the clone doesn't.
Mentions incest avoidance. Relatives need to recognize each other for that too, not just for altruism. Avoiding harmful recessive genes is a huge pressure.
And the idea of older mothers manipulating daughters to help raise siblings in some species.
If the daughter's own chances are low, helping mom raise siblings, R equals 0.5, might be her best genetic bet.
Briefly covers how mutation fuels sexual selection. Well, in a way. How parasites drive rapid host evolution.
Revisits the handicap principle as honest signaling, noting graphins supporting math.
Puzzles over naked mole rat dispersal.
And reflects on the surprising success of the meme itself, its inclusion in the dictionary. The original goal was just to show genes aren't the only possible replicators.
Analyzing old Lang sign and Hamilton citation patterns as meme evolution in action.
And concluding with that warning about blind faith memes and the concept of memeoids.
Okay, so wrapping up this deep dive, the core takeaway really is that radical shift. Viewing evolution from the gene's perspective.
The gene as the fundamental replicator, the organism as its vehicle.
And this lens helps explain so much altruism, selfishness, conflict, cooperation, even cultural change through memes.
Plus the extended phenotype genes influencing the world way beyond the body.
And the aha moment, hopefully for you listening, is seeing how this framework tackles that huge question, why are people? At such a fundamental level.
It gets right down to the mechanisms that have shaped all life. It's often counterintuitive, but incredibly powerful.
Absolutely, and we've really only scratched the surface here. The selfish gene goes into much more depth on all these topics.
Oh, much more. Specific animal examples, social evolution details, the nuances of memes.
So if your curiosity's been sparked, we definitely encourage you to check out the book itself. Dive deeper into the areas that grabbed you.
There's a ton there to explore.
And maybe that leaves us with a final thought to chew on.
Okay.
If our bodies are just these temporary vehicles for potentially immortal genes, driven by this relentless urge to replicate, what does that really mean for our sense of self, our purpose, our individuality?
That's a big one. It definitely challenges how we might instinctively view ourselves and our place in the universe. Something to think about.